Thanks very much. First of all, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good, okay. If a Shure person speaks into a Shure mic and you can't hear me, that's a bad thing. I get in trouble. And if I use a Sennheiser mic, I get struck by lightning. So I got to make sure that doesn't happen today. Okay, so let's talk about wireless microphones a little bit. We'll talk about the, let's see, let's do this. The new UHF TV Band, which you're probably already familiar with, the transition timeline, some new operating rules, which maybe you haven't been aware of, and what Shure's been doing. And I'll also throw in here that, I joke about Sennheiser, but the entire wireless microphone manufacturing community has really worked very closely for many years now in representing wireless microphone users before the FCC. And I think it's because of that very unified effort and coordinated effort that the results on wireless microphone rules have been as favorable as they have been. So overall, we're pretty pleased at the way things have turned out. All right, so let's see. There's several bands that are mostly popular for wireless microphones. The big dog has been and still is the UHF TV band. There's quite a resurgence now in the VHF band as well. And we're also expanding into other bands outside of television, like 902 to 928, the ISM band, also the 1.9 gigahertz DECT band, and even the 2.4 gigahertz band. There are a few other bands that are legal for wireless microphone use, but in some ways are not all that desirable or are more challenging technically. So we're not there yet, but who knows, we'll probably be in 5 gigahertz and 7 gigahertz before you know it. I do not, for the record, see any product development in 26 megahertz. I'm not going to go down there. Too many big antennas. And some of the spectrum is reserved only for licensed users, and we'll talk more about licensing in a couple of minutes. But down along the bottom there, the 941 to 952 megahertz band, which some of you might know as the STL band for studio transmitter links, that's actually open for wireless microphone use. There's also another band I don't have on there that is a fairly recent ruling, which is the 1.4 gigahertz to 1.5 gigahertz band, which is typically used for aeronautical flight testing. So it not only requires that you be a licensed user, and not only requires FCC coordination, but also requires coordination with the flight test organization that manages that spectrum. So typically that's only used for the very largest of events with the most long-range advanced planning, maybe the Super Bowl or something like that. Let's see here. So before the transition, the UHF TV band looked like this, 470 to 698 megahertz. After the transition's over, it's going to stop for us at 614, and the rest of it's used for mobile data. But let's zoom into that a little bit more. As you can see, we've got the channel 14 to 20 range there, which is shared with land mobile, mostly public safety users. A lot of wireless microphone users don't know about that, and fortunately they stay away from it without knowing it, because when they push the scan button on the receiver, it sees some traffic or transmissions and stays out of that channel. And that's only in 13 cities, though, so it's not something you have to worry about everywhere. Then in the TV band itself, you've got unlicensed wireless microphone users who can operate up to 50 milliwatts, and licensed users who can operate up to 250 milliwatts. Very few people do that because the battery life of the transmitter is so short that it's kind of a losing proposition. Typically, the 250 milliwatt units, the handful that we've sold, have been to sports broadcasters who are doing golf tournaments and car races and that sort of thing, where they really need to go half a mile with a transmitter and they don't care if the battery only lasts for 4 hours. Then up in the channel 37 range, of course, we've got the channel reserved for wireless medical telemetry and radio astronomy. Interestingly, white space devices can now utilize channel 37 since they are location aware. they can consult the database, which tells them, oh, you're near a telescope, don't operate on this channel. Wireless mics don't do that, though, so we can't operate in channel 37. After the transition here, we'll have this guard band just above the TV band of 37 there, which is 640, what did I say there, 614 to 616 megahertz. That's actually going to be legal for wireless microphone use and has the advantage of not having any white space device traffic in it. The bad news is it's right next to the downlink band for these new mobile broadband services, so we don't know how clean or how dirty this spectrum is really going to be. It kind of remains to be seen. And it's only 2 megahertz, so we don't know exactly how much people are going to want to make use of that. But any spectrum's good spectrum. There's no bad spectrum. Then we've got mobile broadband, and then up there in the duplex gap, it's actually been broken into subsections there. The good news for broadcasters is there is actually a section of 4 megahertz that is reserved only for licensed users, not for unlicensed wireless mics, and no white space devices in there at all. I think this was a nod by the FCC to trying to accommodate ENG news and sports that kind of happen on an ad hoc basis without a lot of pre-planning sometimes, and trying to allocate some spectrum for wireless mic use that could be used on a regular basis without any pre-planning and without any coordination. We don't make any products in that range yet, but we'll see what happens. If the demand is there, we probably will. Then the remaining 6 megahertz chunk of it is, again, divided up for licensed, unlicensed, and white space device users there. I'll take more questions at the end, but any questions so far on this? This is sort of the big, messy rat's nest of information. No questions yet? Okay. All right, we'll go on here. So that's the what. So basically, if you have wireless microphones that operate in those 2 black areas that say mobile broadband, you have to get out. And we've been telling people this for a couple of years now, especially after we knew the particular borders of where this spectrum would be after the transition. So if you've got microphones in that range, you know you've got to move. The big question then becomes, when do I need to move out? So we've been dealing with lots of planning on that. And the answer here is not as clear as it would first seem. Initially, people thought, oh, well, I've got till July 2020. That's when the transition's over. And then we had to tell them, well, not exactly, because there's these 10 transition phases. And at the end of each phase, when all the TV channels have moved to their new channels, stations move to their new channels, then the telecom providers, the mobile broadband providers, will be able to start doing testing. And as soon as they start doing testing on that spectrum, then you have to move out, even if it's not 2020 yet. So if you happen to be in a city that's in phase 2, let's say, and the transition's all complete by then, that means that you're going to have to move out a lot sooner than 2020. So then people started saying, well, okay, well, at least I've got till like 2018, 2019, something like that. And we said, well, not exactly, because there's this other factor involved here. T-Mobile was the big winner in the 600 megahertz auction, and they bought 2 or 3 or 4 blocks of spectrum almost everywhere they could, pretty much nationwide. And in the cities where they are able to, in other words, in cities around the country where there are no TV stations occupying the channels that they bought in the 600 megahertz band, they're pursuing a really aggressive rollout schedule. So in some cities around the country, especially out in the open west, they're going to be rolling out service before the end of this year, in some cases late November. So basically next month, in some cities, you might start seeing test signals in the 600 megahertz band from T-Mobile. So I was just able to get some information on Friday from our man in Wyoming, and we actually have one. He went out and looked at Cheyenne, where T-Mobile's doing some testing now, found out where their transmitter antennas are on top of a building downtown. and then went about half-mile away to a parking garage, parked on the roof of the garage there, and then did some scanning to see, well, what does it look like? What do these signals look like? How strong are they? So that's what it looks like. The lower one is the downlink band. Obviously, that's going to be the stronger signal, and that's the one that's going to cause more trouble for wireless microphones. It's pretty much like, from a wireless mic user's perspective, it's actually just the same as an occupied TV channel. The signal's too strong there. Unless you're just a handful of feet to the transmitter to receiver, you really can't operate there. The uplink band is definitely lower strength, but we don't know how far away those devices were from the measurement location. So they could have been half a mile, they could have been a couple of miles, we don't know. Plus, those are mobile devices, obviously, portable devices, so those could be in the same room. Those are, moving around, so you never know if they're going to show up at an event or not. So the moral of the story is, as soon as those tests start, legally you have to move out, and from a practical standpoint, you're probably not going to want to operate a wireless mic in that spectrum anyway. By the way, a footnote on the device front, the first actual consumer device that uses the 600 megahertz band is apparently going to be the LG V30 smartphone, which is supposed to ship in time for Christmas. So they're going to be on the streets pretty soon, and T-Mobile is promoting this really, really aggressively. Let's see here. So which systems that you have are impacted, and when do you need to act? The rules are written in such a way that any wireless system that is capable of being tuned to any frequency in those forbidden ranges has to be replaced. In the early stages of this, we were hoping that the rules would be written so that if you owned a system that could be tuned to those ranges, but you tuned it to frequencies that were still legal, that you'd be okay. But it didn't work out that way, unfortunately. So a lot of gear that might just overlap these blocks of spectrum and could otherwise be used by being retuned by a knowledgeable user, which certainly your clients are, unfortunately it's going to have to be replaced anyway. So we weren't too happy about that. And the when, of course, is when the new mobile broadband operator starts testing. We don't know exactly how that notification is going to take place. T-Mobile has talked about sending letters and emails to people, but it appears that they're really contacting major users like TV and radio stations, pro touring sound companies and so forth, maybe a Broadway theater or something like that. There really isn't going to be any massive communication to churches, schools, restaurants, hotels, and so forth that are actually frequent wireless microphone users. So it's going to be a bit of an information challenge to get the word out so that everybody knows and everybody moves in time. I am relatively confident that a lot of users are completely ignorant of this and will just keep using it up until the day it doesn't work anymore. And that's the day they'll call and say, it stopped working, what do I do? And we'll say, read me the number, what does it say? Oh, well, you can't use this anymore. Believe it or not, we are still getting calls from people who are operating in the 700 megahertz band and who should have transitioned out of there years and years ago. And then there are those people who say, well, I don't believe there's any law about this. This isn't a law, is it? And I say, actually, yes. Communications Act in 1934, it is a law. And they say, well, I don't believe it. You're just trying to sell me something. And I said, well, let me email you something that's got an FCC logo on it. You can show it to your manager and try and get some funding. Let's see here. So there have also been some operating rules for wireless microphones that have changed over the last few years and in some cases the last few months. Many of these were in flux for quite a long time and being debated back and forth. For a long time, the FCC declared that there were going to be 2 TV channels reserved in each market for wireless mic operation. We were really kind of banking on that, and then that fell apart about a year and a half ago. So now there won't be any reserved TV channels. All channels are open for white space use. So there isn't anything other than those guard band and duplex gap frequencies that are actually exclusively wireless mic channels. Also, co-channel operation used to be okay if you were more than 70 miles from this TV station's transmit location. And that made it pretty easy to tell people, well, basically, if you're in the same market, you can watch a TV channel, then that means you can't operate on that channel. That rule has been changed now, so now you can operate a microphone, co-channel on a TV station, as long as you are more than 4 kilometers outside the station's coverage profile, the contour. And you're probably wondering, well, how the heck does somebody at a church or a high school know what the station's contour is? There's a database for that, there's an app for that, and you plug in your location and it tells you, okay, you're here, here are the stations you can legally use, the channels you can use. And speaking of the database, the TV Whitespace database registration plan was that any wireless mic user could register in the database and say, hey, I've got a big event going on Tuesday, and we're going to be using these wireless mic frequencies. Don't let the Whitespace devices use those frequencies on that day. That got changed so that now that's only open to licensed wireless mic users, not unlicensed users. And originally it was supposed to have been free. Now the language is a little ambiguous, so I don't know if they're going to try and charge users to register in the database, or if they're only going to charge some. I don't know. We really don't know where that's going to go. Let's see here. Speaking of licenses, everybody in this room is probably kind of familiar with licensing. Wireless microphones have always existed under Part 74 in a subcategory called low power auxiliary stations. And by the way, when I say wireless microphones, when I say wireless microphones, I mean one of these or a body pack. When the FCC says wireless microphones, what they really mean is wireless microphones, in-ear monitors, IFB systems, production intercoms, wireless video camera links, and so forth. Basically, any low-power auxiliary station device that operates in the TV band. Those all are sort of under that same umbrella term of wireless microphones. So any other device the station might have, like an IFB, if it's in the TV band, is still subject to the same rules. Licensing used to be restricted only to broadcasters and film and TV production companies. Now, as soon as smaller and smaller camcorders were available, and then the iPhone, everybody is a TV producer. So how do you regulate that? So the FCC realized that they needed some sort of a updated metric for this. So they decided on large venue owner operator or professional sound company that routinely uses 50+ devices for most events or productions. So if you're not a broadcaster or a film and TV production company, but you are using a lot of wireless for most of your productions, then you can apply for and get a license. And this was designed to accommodate Broadway theaters, as well as the large touring sound companies that do, Springsteen concerts and that sort of thing, that have a lot of wireless being used at the same time on a stage. But since that time, there has been some concern and some consideration to the fact that there are lots of people using wireless microphones for some pretty serious productions that may not be using anywhere close to 50 units. Now, if Ken Burns were to show up and say, hey, I'm going to interview some people for my next program, he might only be using 1 or 2 wireless body packs. But I think we could all agree that that's pretty serious expectation of high quality production values there. So the FCC is looking for ways to find another metric that might accommodate smaller performing arts institutions, let's say, and other users that have no chance of meeting that 50+ metric, but are still producing high quality material. The advantage of being licensed is that you can operate on an occupied TV channel indoors if the signal indoors is less than minus 84 dBm. Now you're probably wondering, well, how would somebody know that? Well, clearly that's a professional user. So somebody like Claire Brothers, who's doing a concert at the United Center in Chicago, they've got the measurement gear. Somebody like James Staffo or somebody like that who's doing frequency coordination for the Daytona 500 or the Oscars, he can measure the spectrum and figure out what's actually present in the performance hall and say to himself, okay, I can actually use this channel even though technically it's an occupied channel. But only licensed users get to do that. And again, licensed users can register in the database, get protected from white space devices, and the way that the registration process works is that you have to put in your license number and you have to say when is the event and where is the event, and how long will it last, and what TV channels will you be using that we need to tell the white space devices to stay out of. There is quite an elaborate definition procedure for your location. You could just put in a street address if you want to, but let's say that you're covering, I don't know, the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Chicago, and it's going to go, 5 miles down Michigan Avenue or something. You can actually define a rectangle that stretches down Michigan Avenue, with some geographic coordinates. So it's a pretty elaborate scheme that lets you, in a sophisticated way, say, okay, we're using this golf course or this racetrack or this amount of the street or something like that. So it's pretty flexible, and I think people will get a lot of use out of it for those larger events. The thing that scares a lot of people off from getting a Part 74 license, people who aren't involved in broadcast, is Form 601, which, as most of you probably know, is like the worst IRS form you've ever seen. The good news is it's only $165. It covers as many wireless microphones as you want. So I highly advise you tell your clients, do the form, send in the money, say you're using 100 wireless mics, just register everything, VHF and UHF, and then work out the details later. Most people take one look at that form and say, oh God, I can't do this, and look for a lawyer to help them out. Speaking of white space devices can now operate on any VHF or UHF TV channel. They get instructions from the white space database. So when they wake up and turn on, they have to contact the database and say, well, here's my location, what channel should I use? And the database says, okay, do this, this, and this, don't do that. And the device says, okay, got it. And then it has to periodically recheck in, and the database has to give it fresh push notification of updates whenever that channel assignment information changes. So if I'm a wireless mic user and I register channel 36 somehow, then the database is going to push that information out within a few minutes to all the devices. Fixed devices originally were subject to a lot of additional constraints because they are higher power, but then the rules were adjusted so that they can operate even adjacent to an occupied TV channel as long as they throttle down to just 40 milliwatts. Normally they operate at about 100 milliwatts. And the new rule is that they can operate up to 10 watts if they're in a sparsely populated area. Now I can see what you're thinking. What is a sparsely populated area? There's a rule for that. It's, I believe it is a location in which less than 50% of the available TV channels are occupied by stations. So basically this is the idea that if you're out in rural Nebraska or somewhere and there's only 3 or 4 stations on the air, then these white space devices, they can put up a base station on a water tower or something and operate at 10 watts and deliver internet that way. It's going to be interesting to see how the white space thing turns out, because there, as far as we can tell, there are maybe 100 or so of these devices currently in use and registered. Because there's been so much certainty about the available spectrum and how the auction was going to turn out, that the industries didn't really dive into white space devices very much. There's one that's used for digital signage in hotels and convention centers, but I haven't really found too many other things that have gotten a lot of traction. Now that we've got some final rules in place, that'll probably start to ramp up. Microsoft specifically has been very aggressive of late in promoting white spaces for rural internet access. So they're really pushing hard to want to serve the rural public with internet in the TV band, as well as those guard bands and so forth where they have access. So we'll see if that really takes off or not, but it's going to be interesting. In case you haven't checked, there are several white space databases that you can access. They all have the same information. They all have to synchronize within 15 minutes of each other. So if you upload information to one, it spreads to all of them pretty fast. I believe there are actually 8 or 9 databases, but these are the 4 that have the easiest interface to access and use. Some of them appeared to be structured more for a subscription model, where if you've already paid them for access back end, you can use them. But those are there, so I encourage you to check those out. I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but this is what we tell most people. Before you buy a wireless mic, find out what TV channels are currently occupied, and then you've got to look up what channels are going to be occupied after the transition. Unfortunately, there is no convenient online electronic database that gives you the future view. You've got to do it manually, which is a little bit of a pain. All the documents are there on the FCC's auction site, which is quite easy to navigate and easy to find things there. For the last several years we've been working on this. We have pretty much updated all the products so that we've got way more frequency bands. The biggest thing has been more microphones per megahertz, more spectral efficiency. Whereas you used to get 6 or 8 wireless mics in a TV channel, now we can do 17 and in some cases even 47 in one 6 megahertz channel. So all we need is one channel and everything will be fine. Everybody will be happy. And of course, everybody loves a rebate. So if you buy new wireless mics, you get a rebate. You send in your old 600 megahertz stuff, and we, dispose of it properly and so forth. We don't care if it's working. We don't care whose brand it is. Shure's doing it. Sennheiser's doing it. Audio-Technica's doing it. So if you do have to buy stuff, you can save a little bit of money. Now we've got a couple of minutes, I think. Questions? Yes.
You had mentioned the spectral protection 4 kilometers.
Yes.
What contour are they using?
What contour? That's a great question. I don't know. Noise limited service contour? I'll go along with that. That sounds good. My mother told me I should have finished high school, and now I'm thinking she was right.
So that's the one that's on the FCC, the one that you look up right at the
Right, and I think that's what the databases are using too, because you can plot contours on those databases.
Chris, you also mentioned that you can measure an occupied TV channel to -84 dBm and operate on that. Now, is that with a calibrated dipole?
I don't know. Good question. I don't know if there's a certain measurement procedure that's required there. I would hope so, because there's probably a whole lot of ways to get to -84 dBm. No antenna at all, maybe, or?
And finally, is any of this reciprocal with Canada?
Not yet, but it probably will be. As someone noted earlier, a lot of the Canadian stations along the border are being rejiggered to be compatible with us. And Canada is probably going to follow, Industry Canada, probably follow in the same footsteps and auction their version of the 600 megahertz band as well. So I anticipate within a year or so it'll probably follow on. One last question?
Last question, I promise.
Yep, okay.
The 10 watt restriction, is that the channels occupied within your market, or do they look at contours again to determine that?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it's within your market. I don't know if it's measured at that location or what. Anyway, I believe everyone's going to get a copy of the presentation, so all this will be in there. If you want to email me and ask questions, feel free. And otherwise, thank you very much for supporting Shure, and have a good day.